Laudetur Jesus Christus, praise be Jesus Christ. This is Matt Gaspers, managing editor of Catholic Family News. And in addition to our weekly news roundup, which we'll do later this week, I'm also having a discussion today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Brian McCall, who is the editor-in-chief of CFN. And we're going to be discussing today in detail his new book. I've got my copy all marked up with notes and sticky notes and stuff, called A Voice in the Wilderness, Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò on the Church, America, and the World. I've been looking forward to discussing this book with Brian, and glad we're able to do it today. So I hope you're doing well today, Brian.
Yes, I am. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Right. So just to get started, and for folks who may not be familiar with this book or the writings of Archbishop Viganò, essentially it's a collection of his works from August of 2018, his original testimony concerning former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, through actually New Year's Day 2021. This year is the final text in the book. And Brian is the editor, so he compiled these texts and also introduces each section of texts, which are arranged not chronologically but topically according to different themes. So if we look at the table of contents here, we see that the three main sections, it's divided into three parts. Part one is called A Voice Decrying Sexual Deviance, the McCarrick Testimony, and that has his Viganò's three different testimonies. The first one is probably the most well-known, but then there were two follow-up testimonies, as well as his reactions to the infamous McCarrick report that was published late last year. And then part two and part three is what we're really going to spend most of our time discussing today, because that gets into the controversy involving the Second Vatican Council and what he calls the deep state and the deep church. So part two is titled A Voice Decrying the Revolution in Tiara and Cope. For those familiar with the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, that's an allusion to that document. We'll get into that when we discuss part two. So that's all about Vatican II and Archbishop Viganò's discussion of that. Oh, here we go. Great. Brian has the table of contents pulled up for us. And then part three is A Voice Decrying the Deep State, China, COVID, and the Great Reset versus President Donald J. Trump. So these are Archbishop Viganò's interventions regarding the temporal, the civil sphere, and how that intersects with the spiritual. We'll maybe spend a little time towards the end addressing objections that people might raise. Well, we love that Archbishop Viganò is addressing the spiritual and the theological and moral crisis in the church, but is it really his place to be speaking about the temporal sphere as much as he has, and voicing support for a particular president, a particular political candidate, etc. So we'll get into all of that. But for starters, I just wanted to focus on the title of the book, because it really goes, Brian really explains it very well in his general introduction. I just wanted to read the first little bit of that, if I could, to give people a flavor of it. So again, the title of the book is A Voice in the Wilderness, and that's an allusion to St. John the Baptist. And interestingly, that's actually how Archbishop Viganò he used that own allusion about himself in his second letter to President Trump in October of last year. He ended the introductory paragraph by saying, "May you accept these words of mine as the, quote, voice of one crying out in the desert." So he quoted St. John the Baptist, applying it to his own situation. So here's from Brian's general introduction to the whole book itself. St. John the Baptist, the son and heir of a priest of Israel, left the hallowed halls of the temple to retreat into the wilderness. From his desert seclusion, he became a voice crying out in the wilderness. He denounced the hypocrisy of the first deep church that had superimposed itself on the religion of the old law. That's a really interesting way to think about Archbishop Viganò being, a new St. John the Baptist, so to speak. And you also go on to describe, what exactly is a deep church, what defines it. You mention it is the artificial imposition by those who hold offices of man-made doctrines and practices that obscure the doctrine and practices established by God. So maybe you can explain a little bit more, how does that apply to the Old Testament ecclesia, so to speak, and how that, is mirrored in our times in the church?
Yes, and I think it helps people to understand what's going on in our time, because our Lord really decried and denounced the first deep church, right? Because there was the religion founded by God through Moses, the Old Testament Jewish religion. But what had happened in the time leading up to Christ, it had been sort of taken over by the scribes and Pharisees that St. John Baptist calls a brood of vipers.
Yes.
And they had, as our Lord said, made void the law of God and put in its place, right, their own laws. Right? They void the law of God when they substitute their own traditions.
Yes.
And so the Jewish religion still was there, right? The scriptures were there, the prophecies were there, the temple was there, the sacrifice was there, but the people in charge were not fulfilling their role, because ultimately we know what they did. What did the great high priest of the time of Christ do? He betrays our Lord to the Romans, has him killed. He refuses to believe that he is the Messiah and the Son of God. And so, rather than fulfilling the roles they were given, the high priest of Israel and the Sanhedrin should have accepted Christ as the Messiah and helped him in his mission. But instead of that, they ally themselves with the secular state, with their political enemies, the Romans, and undermine what the church really should have been doing. And so really that's what I think Archbishop Viganò is saying is essentially going on in the church today, that it's still the church, it's still there, but its leaders have sort of, the current set of leaders are the Sanhedrin, and he uses that phrase himself. He calls Bergoglio's Vatican the new Sanhedrin in one of the texts. Yes. Are sort of doing the same thing, attempting to void the law of God in exchange for what they want to set up as their own man-made traditions.
Exactly. Yes, I think it's a wonderful analogy. It really sets the tone for the entire book, and
yes.
it is in line with how Archbishop Viganò sees himself and his mission, as I mentioned earlier. So, in the general introduction, Dr. McCall provides a great, very brief but informative biographical sketch of Archbishop Viganò, which is very helpful for those who don't know about his personal background. And it draws upon Dr. Robert Monahan's excellent book, Finding Viganò. So that's great to see that as well.
Yes.
And before we move on to part one of the book, I just wanted to give Brian a chance to comment. The last section in the general introduction is called Two Voices 50 Years Apart. I thought Brian might like to comment on that.
Yes, because one of the things I did some research on his biography, relying to a large extent on Moynihan's book, but some other sources. Just wanted to get to try to know his background a little bit. And what sort of struck me as really interesting is that there were lots of parallels in his life with another archbishop, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. They were born almost exactly 40 years apart, Lefebvre in 1905. But there were just some really interesting parallels. I mean, I detail them in the book, but for example, they're both sent to Africa as part of the church's diplomatic corps, right? Archbishop Lefebvre is the apostolic delegate to French-speaking Africa. Archbishop Viganò is sent as the nuncio to Nigeria. There again, and that's just one example. I found lots of other really interesting parallels in their life. And then they both, in their retirement, end up sort of speaking out, being this voice crying out against what's going on in the church. Archbishop Lefebvre, after he retires in 1970, and then obviously Archbishop Viganò after 2016. So I didn't expect to find that, and I detail in more detail, even on the level of thinking, how there's a lot of parallels in the book. But it to me is just sort of was striking.
Yes. One other biographical note that I found very interesting is you mentioned in the general introduction that Archbishop Viganò attended university before entering the seminary.
Yes.
And before ordination, he had completed a master's degree in theology from the Gregorian University and a doctorate in utroque jure, that is in civil and canon law, from
Yes.
the Lateran University.
Yes.
And you explain how it's interesting that seems to be a sign of his future apostolate to speak as a bishop to our modern world. The fact that he's firmly rooted in both the temporal spheres of geopolitics and the spiritual jurisdiction of the church. So God,
Yes.
even from that early age, was preparing him for this mission that he's now in the midst of accomplishing.
Yes, I think there are many signs that God sort of had this mission for him.
Yes. All right. So as I mentioned in the introduction, we won't spend too long covering the part one of the book, because I think most people are probably most familiar with this work of Archbishop Viganò, namely his testimony, his explosive, groundbreaking testimony concerning former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and the role of what he calls the homosexual current that helped to cover up his crimes for so many years, and it includes Pope Francis, according to Archbishop Viganò's testimony. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Brian had anything he wanted to.
No, I think the only thing I'll say about that is to maybe give my perspective and kind of why on Viganò and how I came to the book. Because I'll have to say, in 2018, when he first came out with the testimony, I was skeptical. I was, a lot of people got very excited. This Archbishop Viganò, he's great. And I was a little more reserved in my reaction to the testimony. Mm-hmm. And again, I thought, obviously, this is a good thing. He's bringing to light information he has. But I thought, okay, is this a passing thing? Is he I wondered, is he part of the certain currents within modern Catholic Church that sort of just love salacious news like this and love to just let's just talk about, let's name names and get out all the gory details of what people did. I worried about that. And then I also worried, I said, does he see the big picture here? Because as bad as McCarrick is, and I make no excuses for him, he obviously did some really bad things, and as Viganò points out, should have been punished more. Honestly, the damage he did to the church is nothing compared to the damage that had been to the church over the past 40 years through the errors of Vatican II, the new mass, what Pope Francis is doing. Again, what he did was immoral and damaging, but the church has lived through immoral popes and bishops. I mean, Alexander VI had sired many children, tried to make one of them pope after him. In terms of moral, just salacious, lifestyle, we've had them, but they never touched the level of the church that we have now, right? He didn't try to change the dogma to say that, the popes didn't have to be celibate anymore, or, say that fornication was okay. He never did that. He recognized he was a licentious person and he was bad, but he never touched the mass, never touched these things. And I sort of wonder, okay, is Viganò just sort of caught up in this, which again, I don't mean to undermine, downplay it. It was bad, but again, attacking the doctrine, heresy is the worst sin. It's much worse than a sin against the sixth commandment. And I was skeptical. I thought, is that as far as he'll go? I was proven wrong, obviously, because he, after 2 years of going into the desert and spending a lot of time reading and studying, he came out and saw the big picture and says, I think a quote you want to talk about later, that doctrinal corruption and moral corruption are always connected. And this is not just a moral laxity problem. There's a much deeper problem. And so I think the first part is important, but if you just stop there, it's of very limited importance. It's important because it's a gateway into these bigger issues.
Exactly. And there's one, if I can find it here. So you mentioned in your introduction to part one, and again, part one includes documents related to his testimony concerning McCarrick. So you have the first original testimony, second testimony, third testimony, which is a response to Cardinal Mark Ouellet, the prefect for the Congregation for Bishops, who's also involved in all of this stuff.
Yes.
And then and then the first and second reactions to the McCarrick report, and then one final statement: the faithful have a right to know. So in your introduction to part one, dealing with all the McCarrick stuff, you say it is important to note that the Archbishop's emphasis in this testimony is not upon crimes committed against minors.
Yes.
He does acknowledge the scandal and horror of such acts, Yet the testimony as a whole is more directed at the underlying cause of those crimes, namely a homosexual current that he identifies as present in the Church and the Vatican. This current seeks to change the Church's clear and perennial condemnation of sodomy.
Mhm.
And the next page over, you say, Viganò sees and insists on the strong connection between teaching and praxis. A failure to adhere faithfully to and proclaim publicly the Church's unequivocal teaching on homosexuality is a prominent cause of the abuse crisis. And this seems to be kind of the little initial entry point for Archbishop Viganò to realize that the crisis goes much, much deeper than he originally thought.
Absolutely. And that's what he tells us, that he just, he came out about this, about McCarrick. He sees the cause in terms of the weakening of the teaching on homosexuality, but he doesn't stop there. He said, we have to follow things to their roots. So he doesn't just stop and say, okay, that's it. And that's why I think he disappears for 2 years. We hear nothing from him. From
kind of like St. Paul after the road to Damascus experience.
Kind of, yes.
Disappears into Arabia.
Yes. And he disappeared. And what I know, he was reading voraciously. He was reading histories. He was reading commentaries. And what he was doing is he was looking for the roots. Okay, where does this homosexual current come from? And we get the fruits of his 2 years of study in part 2 and part 3.
Yes. So before we get to part 2 and part 3, I meant to bring up, and I forgot to, maybe you could give us a little background about how this book came about, the involvement of the Archbishop in the process, and how you became acquainted with him personally.
Yes. So as I said, I was somewhat skeptical of him, and what he was about, and what his role would be in the church. But then when he started publishing more, just at the end of 2019, when he published the things about the Abu Dhabi statement, I became much more interested. Then when he came out in the spring and early summer of 2020 with his first statement on Vatican II, I getting more interested. I then was introduced to him by Micah Hickson, who writes for Catholic Family News. You may recognize her name. She also writes for LifeSite News. And she had been in contact with him because LifeSite was one of the news outlets that really kind of broke the testimony, that published the first testimony. And she said, would I be willing to communicate with him because he's interested in spreading what he writes more widely? And I said, certainly. So I began a correspondence with him and got to know him better. And he was always sending us some things exclusively or even earlier, and along with other news outlets. So we would communicate about that. And then as I thought became better and better, I approached him and said, I think you're making a real impact. I kept hearing from people who would have never even thought about some of these issues, but for him. And I said, I think we could help people by bringing all these together, right? Because they were issued over a multi-year period. As we said, not necessarily following chronologically with the same issues. He would sort of talk about one thing here, another thing, another letter. I said, I think we could bring them together into, one collection, and then also provide some help to link the things together, some commentary, a lot of footnotes.
Yes.
I think I ended up with hundreds of footnotes explaining different things he referred to. And he was delighted with the idea, thought it was a great idea. And then he certainly was involved. I mean, I worked on this book from about mid-December through beginning of February, end of January. But then, he wanted to review everything, review the text, review my commentary. And he did that. He conducted a review, sent me some very helpful comments. And so we really collaborated in producing the book. And I do just have to add a little off your question, but in being able to have this correspondence with him and work with him over the past year now, close to a year, I've been very impressed, with the Archbishop. It's another point that reminds me a lot of Archbishop Lefebvre. Many people, who maybe didn't or haven't talked to people, interacted with him. He was very strong, right? He had very strong language, much like Archbishop Viganò. Right? He said things that were not polite society conversations, hard sayings, right? As our Lord would say. But in dealing with people, he was incredibly kind, gentle, And you talk to people that knew him in Africa when he was the bishop there. He was just so kind and holy of a person. And that's how I found real father. That's how I found Archbishop Viganò. Incredibly kind, caring, asks about members. We've had some, chance to talk about things in my life, our family. He asks about that. He shows real concern. So again, I've sensed that same personality as is described in Archbishop Lefebvre, that, very strong on doctrine, very humble, incredibly humble. And I will add, some people ask, well, why doesn't he appear, in live and videos or in person? I think a lot of it is his humility. He is very humble, and particularly humble about his ability to speak in English. I think he's wonderful. I mean, I think his English is incredible, but he, I think, prefers writing or maybe writing something out and then reading it recorded, just because he thinks he's not very good in his communication skills, which I think are not true, but it's just another example. I find him very, very humble.
Yes, that's very good to know. Thank you for sharing that with us. And it's also nice to know for folks wondering, well, what does this book have the stamp of approval of the Archbishop? So we can answer with a resounding yes, absolutely. This book was very much a collaborative work between Archbishop Viganò and Dr. McCall. So,
and again, to be fair, the parts I write are my words, right? They are mine, but he did review them and didn't say, wait, that's not what I mean.
Right. So,
yes.
Right. All right. So we're going to now get into part 2 of the book, which is really, as Brian mentioned, which really started to pique Brian's interest and mine as well in the spring and, well, actually beginning in late 2019 with his response to the whole Abu Dhabi Abrahamic Family House project in particular. And that's when he first started connecting the dots between Nostra Aetate and Dignitatis Humanae, the 2 documents of Vatican II, and their, logical end in the Abu Dhabi document on human fraternity and this Abrahamic Family House project thing. So, as I mentioned before, part 2 of the book, which collects several of his texts on dealing with Vatican II, is called A Voice Decrying the Revolution in Tiara and Cope, Vatican II. And really, I think Brian's introduction to part 2 is one of the most valuable parts of the book. It provides an excellent summary of, how we got from basically going back to the French Revolution and kind of the setting the stage for the modernist crisis a century or 2 later, introducing folks to the permanent instruction of the Alta Vendita, as our dear friend John Venari, God rest his soul, did so many years ago. And now Dr. Taylor Marshall is also introducing a new generation to all of that history. So maybe you could give us just a brief overview of people might be wondering, what does the French Revolution have to do with the Second Vatican Council?
Well, this is one of the problems, and I say it in the book. The point is, like, when you want to explain is, where do you start? I mean, ultimately, you start with the devil's fall and Adam and Eve, I think,
right.
If you want to tell the whole story. But you have to pick a point. And the French Revolution, though, was really a way to overturn everything in civil society, to completely change this temporal sphere of civil society. It wasn't just, we might say, oh, there's one leader, let's just kick this leader out and bring in another one. It was to rewrite everything. Some people don't even know the French Revolution they actually destroyed the week. They got rid of the week. They got rid of all the days of the week, and they got rid of.
Sounds kind of like a great reset, doesn't it?
Sounds like a great reset. It was the first great reset. They didn't want to have 7 days a week. They renamed them all the months. They recounted the years. Beginning from the beginning of the French Revolution was year 1. So it was just a complete attempt to change everything. And it did touch the church because it wanted to sever the church from civil society. It's the beginning, really, of the idea of the separation of church and state. And so what Vatican II really is the second phase of that revolution, to bring that everything must change into the life of the church. So the French Revolution affected the church from the outside. But this was really bringing the French Revolution inside. And as I quote in the book, it's not just me saying that. That's actually Cardinal Ratzinger calling it the 1789 in the church. I'm sorry, not Cardinal Ratzinger. That's Cardinal Swenens calling it the 1789
Yes.
in the church.
But you also do quote Cardinal Ratzinger
Yes.
saying it's that the council basically represents on the part of the church, and specifically Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, as well as Nostra Aetate on world religions, Dignitatis Humanae on religious liberty, is an attempt at an official reconciliation.
Yes.
With
So
the new era inaugurated in 1789.
Yes, but the phrase is the 1790 in the church is Cardinal Swenens. But you're right. Ratzinger says it was a reconciliation, essentially an acceptance of the French Revolution.
Yes.
And I try to build that historical context, how it developed from it to it. Because again, that introduction is important, because again, one of my goals personally in the book was that this book could be available and accessible for anyone. So somebody who's never even heard about these before, never read Taylor Marshall's Infiltration, maybe hasn't really heard about the controversy of Vatican II, can say, okay, well, if I can understand Viganò, I need to understand what he's talking about, and to try to succinctly summarize that to make his writings more understandable and accessible.
Right. Because I think oftentimes Archbishop Viganò's texts kind of have an assumption that the reader already has a proficiency in certain things. So it was very helpful for you to do the work that you've done and bringing it down to the lowest common denominator, so to speak, so that it's accessible to everyone. The other main thing I wanted to highlight in your introduction to part 2, before we talk about a couple of the texts in there, is your section called Viganò and Vatican II, an overview. You say, before presenting the detailed interventions of Archbishop Viganò, I will attempt to synthesize his teaching on this matter. And you say the development of that teaching is epitomized by a phrase he used in his September 14th, 2020 interview with Marco Tassati, namely, quote, moral corruption and doctrinal deviation are intrinsically linked. And that's an incredibly important insight that Archbishop Viganò came to. And it made me think of I wrote a little bit on this subject shortly after the McCarrick scandal broke in the summer of 2018. I wrote an article for CFN, you may recall, as Sexual Abuse and the Third Secret of Fatima, a timely reminder. And I brought up in that article the connection between apostasy and moral corruption. And there's a great quote from St. Augustine of Hippo. I think today is the feast of his mother, St.
Monica. Yes.
So in his work called On Faith and the Creed, he writes, quote, this is the faith which in few words is given in the creed to Christian novices to be held by them. And these few words are known to the faithful, to the end that in believing they may be made subject to God, that being made subject they may rightly live, that in rightly living they may make the heart pure, that with the heart made pure they may understand that which they believe. So the notion of purity of faith and purity of heart going together is a very very ancient, and it's a perennial idea, but it's wonderful that Archbishop Viganò recognized that. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that important insight.
Yes, I think it is profound, because again, there are some what I call more conservative elements in the church who just sort of think about the abuse crisis, for example. Well, it's just, if we could just stop these people from doing these bad things. And that's where you get the reaction, is all of these administrative procedures, right? Let's have all these safeguards and checks. And that's not to say that they're bad in of themselves, but it's like, we've just got, people doing bad things. We just need to catch them and stop them, right?
Right.
Which, okay, you have to do that, but the problem is what's causing this, right?
Right.
And if you don't deal with the cause, you're just going to have more and more stringent procedures, and every priest is going to have to be under surveillance. And I mean, it's not, it's an Orwellian view, because if you just say, we have no idea why these people are doing it, but more and more people are, let's just try to catch them, you're never going to solve the problem. You're just dealing with the symptom. And again, that's what I find so admirable about Archbishop Viganò. He says, the only way to fix this is to fix the underlying root cause, and that is doctrinal deviation.
Right. And the doctrinal deviation ultimately leads to a falling away from grace. And once
Yes.
grace is out of the picture, then original sin, concupiscence, just runs wild, basically.
Yes. Yes.
So a couple of the texts, we don't have time to go into all of them, of course, in detail during this interview, but we did want to highlight a couple of the more important texts, you might say. One of which was definitely his what Brian refers to as his first letter on Vatican II, responding to Bishop Athanasius Schneider, which was dated June 9th, 2020. And this text is really where the first text that he kind of goes full bore on the council, so to speak. And he, for example, it also includes his admission, which Brian mentions in his introduction. Archbishop Viganò says in this text, quote, "I confess it with serenity and without controversy. I was one of the many people who, despite many perplexities and fears which today have proven to be absolutely legitimate, trusted the authority of the hierarchy with unconditional obedience." And this seems to be another major issue that we probably should deal with in this show, is the issue of true versus false obedience. He's really come to a much deeper, clearer understanding of those things.
Yes. But I think in this context, what's important and what makes his testimony in this case so important is he essentially says, look, I believed all this. I spent my entire career in the church defending the hermeneutic of continuity of Benedict XVI, that nothing to see here, nothing new, everything's okay. There was no problem with Vatican II. Or if there's a problem, it was just in its understanding and implementation. There was nothing wrong with it itself. And he says, I believed that. I was right behind you, man. I was, company person. I'm going to defend that. And he's saying I was wrong. And that's, again, takes incredible humility to spend your entire career say you were wrong. Is really, I think, very, very powerful. And his solution is really important because in this letter, as it mentions, he distinguishes and he disagrees with the suggestion of Bishop Athanasius Schneider. So both Schneider and Viganò agree Vatican II is the problem. They're complete agreement on the root cause.
Right.
Where they have been having a discussion is, what do we do about it?
Yes.
To oversimplify it, Bishop Schneider's view is, well, it's just a problem of the words in the text. And we just need to fix some of these texts. So some of these texts have problems. They have errors, they have ambiguities, and we just need to get our red pencils out and go through and cross things out, reword things. And again, I don't think Viganò disagrees. He says, yes, there are, but Viganò's approach is broader. And he says it's more than the words, it's more than the texts. So even if you corrected all the text, you're not going to solve the problem, because he sees, and I think here he's very much been influenced and drawing upon the work of Professor Roberto Mattei, who has spoken at our conference and written for us, in that he says you have to understand Vatican II as transcending the text. The texts are important. They are part of what it is, but what it is actually broader than it. He talks about it as an event. Yes. And so what Viganò says is, if you've got this event that's all jumbled up, and not, again, he never says, he's very clear on this, it's not that every word of Vatican II is heretical, not every statement is bad, not everything that came out of it is bad, but he's basically saying it's so intermixed as an event that you can't separate it. You can't do that because it doesn't solve anything. You just have to sort of throw the whole thing out and start over, right? It's kind of like, this is my analogy, not his. So you're making a cake, right? And you're sort of mixing up the ingredients, and all of a sudden you realize you put rat poison in. There's no real way to go in and well, the sugar is good, the flour is good. If I could just pick out the rat poison, you just have to throw the mix out and go back to square one. Again, that's my analogy, not his. But that's essentially what he says in this, that there's no way to fix this other than, now this is his analogy. He says the thread of tradition has been cut, and to fix this, we just have to rejoin it. And that's what he sort of says. We've cut, Vatican II cut the thread, and we need to go back and restart again from where we were. And that is what's so unique about his public positions on Vatican II.
Yes. And one statement in particular I wanted to read from this this June 9th, 2020 letter, this is the first instance, as I recall, if I recall correctly, that he starts using the language of a parallel church.
Yes.
And throughout, the last year, he's used the phrase neo-church, anti-church, various, meaning all the same reality.
Yes.
The deep church essentially is this term that he's kind of settled on in a lot of his texts.
Yes.
So this is what he says, quote, despite all the efforts of the hermeneutic of continuity, which, as I note in one of my articles, he was holding to that even as recently as, I think it was the summer of 2019, if I recall correctly. He was still holding to, that could still be salvageable. But then come November, I think it was November of 2019, in his text on the whole document on human fraternity and the Abu Dhabi Abrahamic Family House Initiative, finally there he had said, it's not, I'm paraphrasing, but it's not salvageable.
Yes.
So back to the June 9th, 2020 letter, he says, despite all the efforts of the hermeneutic of continuity, which shipwrecked miserably at the first confrontation with the reality of the present crisis, it is undeniable, he says, that from Vatican II onwards, a parallel church was built, superimposed over and diametrically opposed to the true church of Christ. He goes on, this parallel church progressively obscured the divine institution founded by our Lord in order to replace it with a spurious entity corresponding to the desired universal religion that was first theorized by Masonry. So that quote really connects back to Brian's introduction about how this does all go back to the French Revolution, to Freemasonry, which was at the heart of that revolution. And this is probably one of the most important concepts that Archbishop Viganò has communicated to us, this notion of the parallel church, as I said, as he goes on to call it the deep church. And he he kind of clarified what he means by that a little bit in another one of his letters on Vatican II, which Brian calls his fourth letter on Vatican II, responding to Stephen Cox. Stephen had written something on behalf of CFN, kind of basically an open letter to Archbishop Viganò, asking some questions, looking for some clarity. And in that letter, Archbishop Viganò says, quote, I also agree with the observation of His Excellency Bishop Bernard Tissier de Malaray, because that's something that Stephen had asked about the co-presence of two entities in Rome. The Church of Christ has been occupied and eclipsed. That's another major theme in his writings, eclipsed by the modernist conciliar structure, which has established itself in the same hierarchy and uses the authority of its ministers to prevail over the spouse of Christ and our mother. But I did want to, you have a footnote to that section there, and I just wanted to go back to find, because there's a very helpful footnote regarding the thesis or the study of Bishop Tissier de Malaray. You say on page 129, footnote 52, a study by Bishop Tissier de Malaray was first published in French in the tri-monthly review of the Dominicans of Arville. And you say the purpose of the study was to dispute the claim of Father Jean-Michel Glaise that there is no conciliar church in the sense of an organized society. Now, elsewhere, Archbishop Viganò does clarify, clearly he doesn't think that there are two churches, but that there's overlap in almost every area between the true church and the conciliar church. Maybe you could explain that a little bit more for people.
Yeah, and as the footnote tries to explain, this essentially is the same position Archbishop Lefebvre took, and he used the term the conciliar church, because he said, in his famous declaration, he said, we will have nothing to do with the modernist and Protestant Rome. We attach ourselves to eternal Rome. It was one of the phrases he uses, and says that, we cannot accept the conciliar church. And again, I think it's like you're saying, all these words are trying to get at the same concept. And so there's been a bit of a debate between Father Glaise and Bishop Tissier de Marais about what Archbishop Lefebvre meant by this term. First of all, what his intention was and what actually the term means is that is there really some organization, or is it just a sort of metaphor, is kind of the debate. And
Right.
this is where I think Archbishop Viganò says it's not a metaphor, right? There is really kind of these two entities that, as you say, have kind of like an eclipse, have come together and appear to be one, but really we have the moon and the sun, right, in the eclipse.
Right.
And the example he says is that the Pope is sort of at the same time the head of the Catholic Church and the head of this deep church, this conciliar church, whatever you want to call it. This kind of to use an analogy of Chris Farrar in his book, The Great Facade, this virus. So if you think about a virus, you have a body and a virus that are kind of together, and the virus seems to sort of take over your body, but it's not you, but it's in you, right? And it's changing your appearance, but it's not changing who you really are underneath. And in that sense, that's, again, what I think Viganò is getting at by this. Again, I think the Old Testament example helps. Caiaphas is simultaneously the head of the Jewish religion. He is the high priest. When he goes to the altar, he offers sacrifice to God at the altar in the temple. But he's also the head of this infiltrating group that's trying to, say, well, God didn't really mean that, and he wasn't going to send his son, and the Messiah is not this and not that. He sort of is in both roles. And that's what's confusing to the Jews of Christ's time, right? If you think about it, like, well, wait, Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin are telling us not to believe this guy, but wait, you have the words of eternal life, and Christ worked within that, right? He didn't say, oh, Caiaphas, remember he says, listen to what the scribes and Pharisees say, because they sit on the chair of Moses. He doesn't say they've left. He says he uses the present tense, sit on the chair of Moses, but don't follow their example, right? He worked within this ambiguous structure that had these sort of two entities. And that's likewise what the Archbishop clarifies in this letter, because again, he's been accused of a lot of things, but he's accused of, oh, you say that Pope Francis isn't the Pope, you're a sedevacantist. And he says, no, not at all. I'm actually saying the opposite of that Francis and the popes before him they have held the chair of Peter, but kind of in their dual role of also leading this Freemasonically inspired, which is exactly what the Freemasons told us. That's what we mean by a revolution in tiara and cope. Yes. They say in the instruction of the Alta and Vendita, we don't want a Freemason. We don't want somebody who says, I'm a Freemason, I'm just kind of here trying to take over the church. They want somebody who thinks that they are really
imbued with the ideas.
Yeah. Well, imbued with the ideas, but thinks I'm really the Pope and I'm really doing what's best for the church. But really, they're advancing the Freemasonic ideas. So, I mean, that Alta Vendita description is the description of the deep church, the conciliar church within the Church of Christ.
Yes. And real quick, you provide a very helpful quote from Bishop Tissier de Marais, what he explains, quote, the conciliar church is not materially separate from the Catholic Church. It does not exist independently from the Catholic Church. There is a distinction between them, a formal one, without an absolute material distinction. And he goes on, the hierarchy of the conciliar church coincides almost exactly with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The members of the conciliar church are all members, at least material, of the Catholic Church. So there's that very, very much that overlap between the two things.
And again, I think the virus analogy helps, right? Because a virus can't live and reproduce on its own, right? It has to be materially one with you, but it's not you. It's not formally you, even though its matter is mixed in with your matter, is a way to think about it.
Right. Yes. And something helpful that for those who might be concerned or have heard, oh, I'd stay away from Archbishop Viganò because he has sedevacantist tendencies or stuff like that. He says in his letter to his response to Stephen Cox, quote, we cannot judge our pastors for their intentions, nor suppose that all of them are corrupt in faith and morals. On the contrary, we can hope that many of them, hitherto intimidated and silent, will understand, as confusion and apostasy continue to spread, the deception to which they have been subjected, and will finally shake off their slumber. Very important. Some other very important, Archbishop Viganò says many important things in his response to Stephen Cox, specifically about, needing to seek out the traditional Latin Mass, how we have not only the right, but also the duty to do so if it's within a reasonable distance to go to that.
It's kind of like the non abrogata in Summorum Pontificum, that the old rite has never been abrogated, are the two most important words in Summorum Pontificum. I think in that letter, that phrase you quoted is the most important thing, because he goes beyond saying what Benedict XVI would say, that, okay, if people have a right to this Mass, everybody has a right to it. But he says you have a right and a duty to seek out this Mass. That's very, very different, right?
Yes.
Because for Benedict, it's you have a right because you want it, you prefer it. But he understands right in the proper sense of, if you have a duty to do something, then you must have a right to do it. And that's why I think that phrase is so important.
Yes. And one of my favorite sections of this response to Stephen Cox is also, he says toward the end, the lay faithful today have a sacred task to comfort good priests and good bishops, gathering like sheep around their shepherds, give them hospitality, help them, console them in their trials, create a community in which murmuring and division do not predominate, but rather fraternal charity in the bond of faith. That's such a beautiful statement, and it's exactly what we need to be doing. Yes. He goes on regarding the vital role of the domestic church, the ecclesia domestica, the family. He says, the laity have a fundamental role in guarding the faith within their families in such a way that our young people who are educated in love and in the fear of God may one day be responsible fathers and mothers, but also worthy ministers of the Lord. The family is obviously the place where vocations to the priesthood and religious life are fostered and where they come from.
Yes. And I think that's a really important passage, because I think he really speaks from the heart there.
Yes.
And what I think his message is, having gone through this, because he says earlier, it's really hard. He talks about for laity and then advice for clergy. And he says, clergy, it's really, really hard, because he says, if you're going to do what you have to do, you are going to be persecuted, you're going to be cast out, and you're going to suffer more than the laity, right? Because the laity, we used to have a little more we have more freedom, right? We just, I'm just going to go find the true Mass over here and go there. Clergy have a much harder time. And I think what he's saying is, what we need to do is, the laity's job is to support them, right? Not to cause more trouble for them, we need to support them. It's almost like the work, if you think about, if you've seen the movie Unplanned or read the book of Abby Johnson,
right?
When Abby Johnson was kind of realizing, I need to get out of this, if she had gone to the 40 Days for Life people that helped her, and they're like, you, Abby, you're our enemy, get out of here. We don't, who knows what would have happened? What did they do? They said, don't worry about anything. We're going to help you. We're going to find you a new job. We're going to take care of you. We're going to help get you a lawyer to protect you. They just sort of moved in and embraced her and said, you don't need to worry. You've done the right step. Everything. Don't worry about anything else. We're going to take care of you. And that's what I think he's saying from personal experience, right? Yes. Priests need the laity, because if they go out into the wilderness, they're out in the wilderness, right? And they need the laity to help them, to take care of these things for them. And I think that's kind of what he's calling for, is a sort of Abby Johnson type movement to say, if you want to get out of the conciliar church, don't worry about anything. We are going to be here for you, and you don't have to worry about that, like how you're going to deal with this persecution, which will come. And that's important, because
I was just going to say, I think he might also be. I think you're stalling on my side.
No. Can you?
Hello.
Yes, I'm still here. And what I think is important about this passage as well, is an important lesson for maybe people have been subscribing to the Catholic Family News for decades, for a long time, because another criticism I've heard of Archbishop Viganò often comes from hardcore long-term traditionalists, and I've heard this from certain people. Oh, Viganò, I don't want to pay attention to him. I've been doing this for 30 years. He just showed up a year ago. Who's he? Right? I can't trust him. He's just late to the party, right? What about all the years I did this? And he is, I think, sent to us, and that's one of his roles, to remind those of us who've been doing this for decades, we can't get that attitude, right? Our attitude has to be, thank you, you're welcome, come over, we're so happy that you've done this, and not, well, where were you 30 years ago? Why didn't you do this in 1985, right? And I think that's, again, what I read in this passage is saying, priests, don't do that to priests that come over to tradition. Don't treat them like latecomers to a party.
Don't be the caricature that people use
Yes.
to dismiss traditionalists.
Yes.
Exactly. So the final text we want to give a brief overview to in part 2 before we move on to part 3. And I love that you ended part 2 with this text, because I think it's a perfect bridge from talking about the errors and the problems with Vatican II and then going into the deep state, deep church, all of that stuff, is Archbishop Viganò's lecture that he gave last October at the virtually to the Catholic Identity Conference. And the title of this talk is How the Revolution of Vatican II Serves the New World Order. So it's tying those two things together. And you mentioned in your introduction to part 2, if someone is going to read only a single text of Archbishop Viganò, this address should be it. Why do you say that?
And again, I mean it a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I think you should read the whole book. But
well, of course,
in a sense, if there's only one thing you're going to read, because it ties everything together, and it gets to all of our questions about what does Vatican II have to do with the Great Reset, the New World Order, how can this stuff all have happened? And he sort of synthesizes everything he said about Vatican II, what's wrong with the hermeneutic of continuity, why the new Mass has to be avoided, why you have a duty to avoid it. All this comes together, and then he pulls it together and says, because this is all part of this essential epical battle between God and the devil. And there's sort of, what's playing out in the church is playing out in the world. And he just sort of pulls everything together in that. Now, it's a lot more detail in all the other text and explanation, but it kind of is the synthesis, I think, of everything else in the book.
Right. And one thing that he brings up in his talk that I found very interesting, I hadn't really considered, is he talks about in section 4, the sense of inferiority and inadequacy, which ultimately ends up ending on that subject at the end of the talk. But he talks about there was a time in the post-war period, after the end of the Second World War, when the revolution led by Freemasonry in the civil, political, and cultural spheres breached the Catholic elite, persuading it of its inadequacy in the face of an epochal challenge that is now inescapable. Looking at the defeat of the European civilization that the church had helped to form, basically the fall of Christendom after the First and Second World Wars, the elite thought that the lack of agreement with the world was caused by the intransigence of the papacy and the moral rigidity of priests not wanting to come to terms with the zeitgeist or the spirit of the age and open up. And he says something very profound next. He says, so in other words, it's like they wanted to call for a ceasefire between the church and the world and kind of come to a friendly understanding, so to speak.
And remember Ratzinger, Vatican II was a reconciliation with 1789.
Yes.
Yes.
But Viganò very astutely observes, he says, courting a pact of non-belligerence with the world means coming to terms with Satan. Because what do we read in sacred scripture? The first epistle of St. John, the world is seated in wickedness, that it's under the control of the evil one in a certain, temporary way, obviously only by God allowing that. But as he observes, the world has its own prince, and that's for a reference, Jesus referring to the devil there.
Yes.
So he talks about the church's sense of inferiority in the post-war period and failure before the world created the, quote, perfect storm for the revolution to take root in the Council Fathers and by extension in the Christian people. I thought that was a very interesting insight from that talk. And as Brian said, he goes into much greater detail than we have time to get into in this interview. So I highly recommend that you get a copy of the book, and so you can have all the commentary that goes with this excellent talk. And I know we're getting short on time, so we definitely want to cover the third part of the book, which is a voice decrying the deep state. And this is where we're getting more into the temporal, the civil sphere, China, Biden, COVID, and the Great Reset versus President Donald Trump.
And maybe to talk about this, let's just hit, again, I think another criticism and talk about this part of the book. So again, I've heard some traditional Catholics and others say, yeah, I like all this stuff on McCarrick and Vatican II, but what's he talking about Donald Trump for? Like, that's not his role. Why is he doing that? And I think there's two explanations for it to make sense of this third part. Like, what's it doing there? Why is he writing all this? Number one, I think, is on a human level. And number two is on a supernatural level. So on the human level, I think one of the attributes of his character is that when he gets a job, he throws himself into it. So I talk about when he was put in charge of the Vatican City State, he's like threw himself into it and turned tens of millions of dollars of deficit into a surplus in 1 year, because he just, and in fact, that's probably why he got fired, or moved out, promoted up to nuncio, right, because he was uncovering a lot of the corruption that's coming out now in the Vatican, and he's getting too close for comfort. So, but when he was assigned when he got promoted out of the Vatican to the nuncio, what I sense, he came to this country and he said, okay, I'm in America. I'm going to love this country. And I think he talks about, and I think he really sees America as his adopted country from that time, that very short period he was here.
Right.
And he loves America. If you notice in those letters, he doesn't say your president. He says our president.
Yeah,
I mean, he's Italian. And I think that part of why is he writing all these letters is because he loves our country. And he sees that the sheep have been abandoned. That to use a phrase of Benedict XVI, that the pastors have fled for fear of the wolves. So there's this wolf about to take over our country, Joe Biden, and the bishops of our country run away. They don't really do anything. They make one or two whimpers here or there, but essentially nothing. And I think he says they need like what the primate of the country would do. The chief prelate would write a pastoral letter saying that here's what's going on. And then when things go badly, would write another pastoral letter saying, don't be afraid. Everything is going to be fine. This is what we're doing. And would be a father to a country that's torn apart. I think more, as I've written elsewhere, more than that since the Civil War. And I think he says, well, there's a vacuum here. The American bishops are not telling the Americans what to make of all this. I'm going to fill that vacuum because I have this. Benedict created an important connection between me and the American people. So on the personal level, I think he feels this duty to step in and do what Cardinal Wuerl, Gregory, McCarrick never did and don't do for us. Exactly. Then on the supernatural level, here's the other explanation. I think one of the things he has read about deeply in his preparation for these statements and his new thinking is on the social reign of Christ the King. And yes. I think he really believes it. I mean, I think I think it was the light that went on. And the social reign of Christ the King is all about, you can't separate the church from daily life. You can't say, well, this is Vatican II and that's the church stuff, and this is politics and Joe Biden, right? That is the modernist approach. And the reign of Christ the King says Christ is king of everything, and everything relates to Christ's battle against the devil. And therefore, the church talks about everything. The church is competent to give moral judgments and advice and guidance and teaching on every aspect, on what's going on with the coronavirus. Again, what's the big flaw? We talked about an interview I had yesterday, which you may watch on our channel with Phil Lawler, that essentially the bishops are, oh, well, whatever the Dr. Fauci's tell us, we'll do it. Whatever the experts say, we don't have any, we have no thinking of our own. We have no competence. No, where he says bishops need to say, okay, we'll listen to your advice. You're a doctor. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to decide what the Catholic Church does. And because that's Christ the King. Christ is in charge. And I think Viganò really believes that. And that's what all this writing is about, right? Put aside the details about Donald Trump, the election, lockdowns. I think the heart of it he's saying is all of this is related to what's going on in the church, to the reign of Christ the King. And so I need to talk about all of it. So yes. I think that's how to understand part 3.
Yes. And one thing in particular I wanted to bring up that people may have had questions about is this notion of the scriptural term catechon, because that features prominently in his writings to President Donald Trump and elsewhere. Let's see, you mentioned in your introduction to part 3, the alliance of the post-conciliar church with the globalist elites has elevated the conflict to biblical proportions. And you talk about, in his lecture to the Catholic Identity Conference, Archbishop Viganò reminds us of St. Paul's teaching that God placed the church, and in particular the supreme pontiff, as the catechon to the manifestation of the mystery of iniquity. So could you give us a brief explanation of what is the catechon? Where does that appear in Scripture?
So a shorthand way I think to understand it is the catechon is like the roadblock to the coming of the Antichrist, the son of perdition, the final battle against the church. And the catechon is sort of like the thing that's holding that back. It's and maybe another analogy, it's like the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, right? It's holding it back. And what the church is, the scriptural exegesis always said is that's the church and the Pope, that sort of they're holding back until God's time comes, these forces. But what the problem, Viganò says in our time, is the Pope sort of pulled his finger out of the dike and said, hey, come on, right? Hey, can we get together in Davos with you to the forerunners of the son of perdition? Right. Hey, can we invite you to the Vatican for a big conference? And instead of being the roadblock or the obstacle, they become like the facilitators of this. And that's what he says. And so God, who God's will never be frustrated. When the person he wants to do something fails and abandons it, he always brings someone else, right? Someone else comes in and he uses not as well, right? He uses imperfectly because they're not who's meant to do it, but to fill that role. And that's how he sees Donald Trump. So again, some people said, he's equating Donald Trump to the Pope. No, what he's essentially saying is the Pope's MIA, Donald Trump is standing there and is like, wait, nobody's defending this, and picked up the gun and sort of said, get back, right? Not that he's the Pope, but that he is fulfilling this role of doing what he can, which is much more limited than the Pope could if he would actually do it, to kind of hold back these forerunners, these precursors of the Antichrist, to sort of push them back and say, no further, stop, you can't do that. And that's why Donald Trump is so important. Now, again, it says maybe Donald Trump, and that's why he writes to Donald Trump. He probably doesn't even understand what he's doing, right? He's not even Catholic. Right. So he probably doesn't even realize he's fulfilling this role of sort of stepping in to fill the breach.
I love what he says in this regard in his second open letter to President Trump, which is dated October 25th of 2020, in which Archbishop Viganò deals a lot with the Great Reset and COVID and all of that. And he says, as is now clear, the one who occupies the chair of Peter has betrayed his role from the very beginning in order to defend and promote the globalist ideology, supporting the agenda of the deep church, who chose him from its ranks, referring, of course, to the St. Gallen Mafia and the conspiracy to get Jorge Mario Bergoglio elected. So Archbishop Viganò says to President Trump, Mr. President, you have clearly stated that you want to defend the nation, one nation under God, fundamental liberties and non-negotiable values that are denied and fought against today. It is you, dear President, who are the one who opposes, namely the catechon, who opposes the deep state, the final assault of the children of darkness. So very powerful words to President Trump.
And to be honest, how I personally read those letters, as one of their goals, I think they are invitations to conversion. I think that was Archbishop Viganò's way of saying to Donald Trump, hey, you've done some good things here. You're kind of turning the things around, but think of how much more you could do if you were Catholic. Think about there's a context around you that you don't see, right? You are doing battle not with flesh and bones, but principalities and powers. Why don't you join us? I mean, again, that's not his words, but that's how I read that. I think he longs for, Archbishop Viganò longs for the conversion of Donald Trump. And I think they were invitations to that in a certain sense.
Yes, definitely. So maybe the last document from the book that we can cover, as we're running a little short on time, this is one of my favorite texts from Archbishop Viganò concerning these things in the temporal sphere, the civil sphere, but they always have an overlap with spiritual realities. As Brian said, this is not a battle against flesh and blood. It is a battle against the devil and his minions. So Archbishop Viganò penned a text last fall. Let me see if I get the date here. Yes, it was November 25th, 2020 is the date given to this text. And it's a meditation on the Great Reset and the liberty of Christians. And Brian gives a great summary for the, we hear a lot about these new terms, the Great Reset and all of this, but Brian gives a great introduction to all of that in his introduction to part 3 of the book. So I highly recommend getting the book for that reason as well, to help you understand what is this thing we call the Great Reset and build back better, all that stuff. So Archbishop Viganò does the same in his meditation on the Great Reset, and he says, a world plan appears in its disconcerting reality. You've probably heard us quote this text before because it's so good on our news broadcasts and other things. Viganò says, the architects of the plan, creating an unjustified social alarm about an alleged pandemic, have used it to create a tremendous global social and economic crisis, and so to legitimize the drastic reduction of the basic rights of the population. It is what its authors themselves call the Great Reset, the global reset of the economy, of society, and of masses of people, and which he acknowledges Pope Francis has certainly given himself over to this effort. Multiple examples, Brian cites a couple of them in his introduction. But I think to tie all of this back again to the French Revolution and the revolutionary spirit, Archbishop Viganò gives a really amazing insight into the history of revolutions, where he says, the French Revolution wiped out the Western aristocracy. The Industrial Revolution obliterated the peasants. The Revolution of '68 demolished the family and the school, referring to 1968 and contraception, all of that. Then he says, this great reset desired by the globalist elite represents the final revolution with which to create a shapeless and anonymous mass of slaves. So I don't know if Brian had anything he wanted to reflect on that history of the revolutionary spirit and how we're seeing it kind of come to its really terrifying climax in our current days.
Well, again, it's what we talked about in talking about Vatican II, that we can talk about revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, et cetera, but they're really all phases, and this is what his great insight is, in one revolution that is just progressing throughout history, ultimately to get to, again, what we've been talking about, the end times, the coming of the Antichrist, to prepare the world for that. And then he sees the Great Reset in this way. And I think the term that he uses that really captures that is the term, the invisible enemy. Now, maybe viewers recognize that. It was something Donald Trump used a lot, but interestingly, in tracing it, he starts using it. There are a couple references, but he really only starts using it to refer to more than the virus. So in the early days of coronavirus, he called it the invisible enemy, but then he starts using it late in the summer when he clearly doesn't mean the coronavirus, he means something else. After that phrase is used by Archbishop Viganò in the letter to him. Because when Viganò says the invisible enemy, he means ultimately the devil. And he makes that clear. He says, who is the invisible enemy? It is the devil. And this revolution is really the revolution, as I said, that starts with the devil's non serviam and is playing itself out to that endpoint in history. And he really, in this meditation, puts the Great Reset into that context, to see it as part of that. Not so that we lose hope and say, oh, it's horrible. But as he says in his interview with Steve Bannon, the first step in responding to this is that we have to understand what's going on, right? We can't do anything if we don't see what's going on and call it what it is. And so he says that is the key to the next two steps, which are to object to it and then to pray. And so that's really what this meditation is all about, is you don't do it to panic and run away and think of the world, there's nothing I can do, but you do it as a preliminary to move forward with God's plan. Yes,
I think that's a great place to end. Steve Bannon's interview is the last text in the book, and it ends with what you refer to as Archbishop Viganò's 3-point plan. Number 1, becoming aware of what globalism's plan is, as Archbishop Viganò says. Number 2, firmly denouncing this infernal plan. And finally, it is necessary to pray, he says. Asking the Lord to grant each one of us the strength to resist. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this discussion of the book. Again, it's called A Voice in the Wilderness, Archbishop Viganò on the Church, America, and the World. and it is available, as Brian has displayed on the screen, from Angelico Press. It's a really not, I have the hardcover, and I'm glad I got that because it's really sturdily made and it's going to last. I know that. So great book, great resource to have in your library. I think this is really, Archbishop Viganò is going to go down in history as a very historic figure in this time, and really a gift from our Heavenly Father for this time to navigate the storms that we're facing. So.
Yes, well, thank you for conducting the interview, Matt, and bringing people's attention to the book. And please, again, buy a copy, send it. And I think what I said to you about being accessible, I think you can send it to somebody who doesn't, who's just thinking about these for the first time, and say, hey, why don't you just read this and we'll talk about it. So it can be, an introduction or a gateway for people into a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. A tool for evangelization,
yes.
and bringing people to a knowledge and love of
yes.
sacred tradition.
Yes.
So if you've enjoyed this interview, we always ask for your support by liking the video. Make sure to give us a thumbs up and share it on your social media, wherever you're on social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And ultimately, if you enjoy the free content that we produce and make available online, we do ask for your support in the form of a subscription to our monthly publication, Catholic Family News. We have the May edition, which is now available. If you sign up, you can get immediate access to the e-edition. And if you'd like a paper subscription, please give us our office a call at 1-800-474-8522, and we'll get you signed up for a paper subscription. So until next time, we wish you well, and God bless you and Godspeed.